I still remember the laugh. It wasn't careless. It wasn't harmless. It was sharpened, like glass splintering in my ears. The CEO's son leaned back in his leather chair, wrist draped over the armrest as though the room belonged to him. His cufflinks gleamed under the boardroom lights. His cologne drifted like arrogance in the air, and his smile, God, that smile made my skin crawl. He didn't lower his voice. He wanted everyone to hear. "That's your monthly salary?" His laugh cracked through the silence, cold and merciless. "I spend more than that in a single day. That's pocket money for me." For a moment, the room stilled. Papers shuffled, chairs creaked, but no one looked at me. My coworkers' eyes darted to their screens, to the table, anywhere but toward me. Their silence was worse than his words. It told me what they were all thinking. Don't get in his way. My face burned, but I kept my head down. I let the insult hang in the air like smoke choking the room. If I said anything, if I even blinked wrong, the damage would spread. So I swallowed it. On the outside, I was quiet. But inside, something shifted. The sting of humiliation didn't fade. It hardened, it froze. And beneath that cold surface, I felt something darker awaken, a sharp, deliberate calm I hadn't felt before. He thought it was over with a laugh. But I knew in that moment it had only just begun. The rest of the meeting blurred into noise. Numbers, graphs, projections, all meaningless echoes. My mind kept circling back to that smirk, that casual cruelty. My salary was his joke, my life reduced to his punchline. But what he didn't know was that invisibility has power. People don't notice the quiet ones. They don't see what we see. And I had been watching him for months. I noticed the way he arrived late, eyes darting, tie loose as if he had been somewhere he shouldn't. I noticed the hushed phone calls in the hallway, his tone sharp, his expression shifting from arrogance to unease. I noticed the invoices on his desk, details that didn't match the copies in my files. Arrogance leaves fingerprints, and his were smeared everywhere. That night, my apartment felt smaller than ever. The paycheck on the table mocked me, his voice echoing inside my skull. Pocket money. I should have cried. I should have let it go. But the tears never came. Instead, something colder took their place. I opened my laptop, logged into the company system. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. One search led to another, and then another. At first, it was curiosity. Just a peek at his department's expenses. A glance at reports no one ever cared to read. But then I saw them. Patterns, numbers that didn't add up. Vendor names that repeated too neatly. Transactions buried just deep enough to be ignored. My breath caught. This wasn't random. This was deliberate. The CEO's son wasn't just arrogant, he was reckless. Midnight came and went. The city outside dimmed, but I couldn't stop. File after file unfolded in front of me, and each one painted a clearer picture. Shell accounts, inflated invoices, money funneled through names that looked real until you searched twice. Every thread I pulled tightened into one knot, and at the center of it was him. He wasn't clever. He wasn't even careful. He was a thief wrapped in silk, too spoiled to imagine anyone could catch him. I leaned back, my pulse hammering, my hands trembling. I should have closed the laptop. I should have pretended I saw nothing. But his laugh echoed in my head again, the sound slicing through me, and I knew there was no turning back. This wasn't about my salary anymore. This was about power, and power once taken is never given back. The next morning, he strolled into the office as if the world bent to his stride. His cologne announced him before his voice did, his smile as smug as ever. The others laughed at his jokes, gathered around him as though proximity might elevate them. I watched from my corner, silent, unimportant, unnoticed. That was what he thought I was, unseen. But unseen doesn't mean powerless. It means waiting. It means choosing the right moment. And my moment was coming. That night I found it, one document buried in a folder I almost skipped. At first glance it looked harmless. Just another contract, just another number. But the more I read, the colder the room seemed to grow. My hands stilled on the keyboard, my breath shallow. Because this wasn't arrogance anymore. It wasn't sloppiness. It was a crime, one that could burn the entire company to the ground. And it carried his signature. I stared at the screen, my reflection flickering back at me in the glow. My finger hovered over the mouse. My chest felt tight, my pulse loud in my ears. With one click, I could change everything. His career, his father's empire, my life. But the thought gnawed at me. If I pulled him down, would I drown with him? The cursor blinked at me, steady, patient, as though it knew the weight of the choice I held in my hands. I closed the document without saving, but the image of it burned into my mind. I couldn't unsee it. I couldn't unknow it. That night, sleep didn't come. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the city outside humming like a restless beast. Every time I shut my eyes, I saw his face, his smirk, his cufflinks, his laugh. But now it merged with the numbers, the forged names, the trail of stolen money. When the sun finally crept through my blinds, I knew the truth. The humiliation had tied me to him, but the secret chained me tighter. I couldn't walk away anymore. I wasn't just angry. I was invested. The office smelled of coffee and fresh ink the next morning, the chatter of routine covering the hum beneath my skin. I typed, filed, smiled where I had to, but all the while my eyes tracked him. He strutted in late as usual. His jacket was slung carelessly over one arm, his tie loose, his phone buzzing with calls that seemed to drain him more than they should. His laugh was still sharp, but I noticed something beneath it now. An edge of strain, a flicker of nerves quickly buried. He thought he wore his mask well, but I had already seen behind it. I spent my breaks digging deeper. Lunch hours weren't for food anymore. They were for numbers. Vendor names that sounded like shadows. Payments split into strange fragments. Transfers routed through accounts that disappeared into the ether. I started keeping notes, scribbled in a small notebook I carried everywhere. At first it was only figures, arrows, underlines. But then words crept in. Careless, greedy, untouchable. Each page filled with evidence, but also with something darker. I wasn't just documenting his crimes. I was building his coffin nail by nail. And yet, I couldn't shake the thought. What if someone noticed me digging? It happened one afternoon. I was hunched over my desk, pretending to sort through old reports, when a shadow fell across the paper. "You work too hard." His voice, his cologne. I looked up, and there he was, leaning on the edge of my desk with that same lazy grin. His eyes scanned my face, my desk, the open file I quickly closed. "Not that it matters," he added, smirking. "Work as much as you want. You'll never get paid what I waste in a weekend." He laughed again, softer this time, as though he were sharing a secret. Then he walked away, phone to his ear, his arrogance trailing behind him like smoke. My hands trembled, but not from fear, from something colder, because I realized something in that moment. He suspected nothing. He would never suspect me. And that invisibility, it wasn't just survival anymore. It was my weapon. The days blurred, each one a careful balancing act. By day, I was the quiet worker with polite smiles. By night, I was a hunter, following the digital blood trail he left behind. And the deeper I went, the more tangled it became. Accounts spread across continents. Transfers broken into fragments. Invoices tied to companies that didn't exist. It was sloppier than I expected, but massive. This wasn't pocket money. This was millions. My chest tightened. If I exposed this, the scandal would consume the company. His father, the board, every investor, they'd all burn in the same fire. But the thought didn't scare me. It thrilled me. One night, as I traced another string of accounts, I stumbled on something different. A payment larger than the rest, disguised but badly. It wasn't just a fake vendor. It was a shell company, linked directly to his name. For the first time, there was no smokescreen. No middleman, just him. My pulse thundered, my notebook filled with frantic scribbles. His arrogance had finally carved his name into the evidence itself. It was the proof I needed, the kind that couldn't be explained away. But as I leaned back, staring at the screen, a thought froze me. If I had found this, what if someone else had too? The next day he looked different. Still arrogant, still smiling, but I noticed a flicker in his eyes. His phone rang more often. His office door stayed closed longer. He whispered instead of bragged, and once, just once, I caught him staring at me from across the room. His eyes lingered too long, searching for something before he turned away. For the first time, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Had I been invisible too long? Or had I finally been seen? I told myself it was paranoia. But paranoia is just another word for survival. That night, I went back to the files. Back to the trail. And as the hours bled into dawn, I realized something terrifying. There weren't just financial crimes hidden in the system. There were names, connections, people I recognized. And one of them was someone who should never have been there. My breath caught. My stomach twisted. Because if this document was real, then the CEO's son wasn't just stealing money. He was building a web, and I had just stepped into the center of it. The web stretched wider than I thought. What began as arrogance wrapped in silk was unfolding into something colder, older, and infinitely more dangerous. The CEO's son wasn't just bleeding. Money from the company. He was tied to things that didn't belong in boardrooms or balance sheets. I told myself to stop. I told myself to shred my notes, close my laptop, and forget. But the notebook called to me, each page heavier than the last. Every line of ink carried proof of his recklessness, his greed, his weakness. And buried beneath it all, one question clawed at me. If he was so careless, how had no one caught him before? The answer came like a whisper. Maybe someone had. Maybe someone had stayed silent. I began to change my routine. I stopped eating in the break room, stopped talking to anyone more than I had to. My world narrowed to the glow of my screen, the ink of my notebook, the shadow I carried behind me. But shadows can be noticed. One evening, long after most had gone home, I heard footsteps behind me. My heart hammered. My fingers froze over the keyboard. I closed the file, forced my face calm. It was him. Of course it was him. "You work late," he said, his tone light but his eyes too sharp. He leaned on the cubicle wall, scanning my desk as though memorizing every detail. "Trying to prove yourself?" I gave a small smile, a shrug, something forgettable. He chuckled, adjusted his cufflinks, and walked away. But the sound of his shoes down the hallway felt heavier than any words. That night, I locked my notebook in a drawer. I shouldn't have, but paranoia had teeth now. My dreams twisted with fragments of invoices, his laugh echoing, the glow of the screen searing into the back of my eyelids. The next morning, the drawer was unlocked. The notebook was still there, untouched, but the lock was broken. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages. Everything was where I left it, every number, every vendor, every scribbled note. But the air around me felt thinner, the office colder. He knew. I didn't know how much, but he knew. And suddenly, invisibility didn't feel like safety anymore. It felt like bait. I needed more proof, something undeniable, something that couldn't be twisted into paranoia or dismissed as coincidence. So I dug deeper. Hidden folders, password-protected files. I bypassed them carefully, slowly. Each barrier cracked open, revealing another piece of the truth. And then one night, I found what I'd been searching for. It wasn't just spreadsheets this time. It was correspondence. Emails. Messages written in his careless voice. Dripping with entitlement. Filled with instructions that reeked of fraud. He wasn't just sloppy with numbers. He was sloppy with words. And in those words, he had signed his own downfall. But the discovery didn't give me relief. It filled me with dread. Because scattered in those messages were hints of things I didn't understand. Deals that stretched beyond the company. Names of people I had no business reading about. Numbers tied to places that made my blood run cold. This wasn't just a son stealing from his father's empire. This was a son dancing with fire he couldn't control. And I realized, sick to my stomach, that if I exposed him, I might not just ruin him. I might expose something larger than either of us. The next morning he looked tired. His usual grin was tighter, his eyes darting more than before. His phone calls grew sharper, shorter. He barked orders with less patience. And then he glanced at me. Just for a second, long enough to make my stomach drop. I couldn't tell if he knew what I had found, or if he simply sensed that something was slipping from his control. But in that moment, I made a decision. I wasn't going to stop, even if it consumed us both. The notebook stayed with me everywhere now, on the subway, at home, even in bed. It felt like a lifeline, but also a curse. I wrote until my hands cramped, drew maps of connections I barely understood. Each line ended with his name. But the closer I got to the truth, the more I felt the air closing in. The hallway footsteps at night, the broken drawer, the weight of his stare. And then one night, I found something in the system I hadn't seen before. A file, locked, with my name on it. The file waited on the screen like a trap door. My name in bold letters, cold and clinical, daring me to open it. My hands hovered over the keys, trembling with questions I wasn't ready to answer. I told myself it was nothing, a coincidence. Some HR record misfiled into the wrong system. But the lie cracked before it could settle. He was careless, yes, but not stupid. If my name was there, it was because he had put it there, and he wanted me to see it. The lock on the file wasn't strong. 3 failed attempts and it opened. My breath caught in my throat as the screen flooded with documents, snapshots, logs. Every email I had sent in the last 3 months, screenshots of my work computer, security camera stills of me at my desk, alone, scribbling in my notebook. He had been watching. Every late night, every stolen moment, every flicker of rebellion I thought was invisible. All of it cataloged, all of it weaponized. My first instinct was to close the laptop, slam it shut, pretend I hadn't seen. But the images burned into me, branding themselves like scars. This wasn't paranoia anymore, it was proof. The broken drawer, the sudden stares, the shift in his laugh. He knew, he had always known. And yet, he hadn't stopped me. Why? The question hung like smoke. If he wanted to silence me, he could have. He had power, money, reach. Instead, he left breadcrumbs, taunts almost. No, not almost. He was playing. He was watching me circle the cage, testing the bars, thinking I was clever. And he was enjoying it. The thought turned my fear to fury. My humiliation from that night, the pocket money laugh, that had stripped me bare, blazed through my veins again. But this time it didn't paralyze me. It sharpened me. If he wanted a game, he had chosen the wrong opponent. That night, I didn't go straight home. I rode the subway past my stop, through 3 more stations, until the cars were nearly empty. The city outside blurred into streaks of neon and shadow, and I let my mind spiral. I couldn't just expose him. If I did, he'd bury me with the file he'd built. Emails twisted, screenshots cropped, timelines rearranged. In his father's eyes, I would look like the thief, the liar, the unstable employee digging where she didn't belong. No, I couldn't just reveal him. I had to destroy him. The difference was subtle, but it mattered. Exposure was a light. Destruction was a fire. And to start that fire, I needed kindling. I spent the next weeks carefully shifting the balance. Small things, unnoticeable at first. Adjusting schedules, rerouting approvals, moving files where he wouldn't expect them. Each action a thread pulled from the seams of his safety net. And then one evening, the net began to fray. He stormed into the office late, his tie loosened, his temper sharp. I watched from my desk as he slammed his phone onto the table, snapping at whoever dared approach. His laugh was gone now, replaced by tight lips and twitching hands. Something was slipping. Something I had nudged. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt the walls shake with risk, because the angrier he became, the closer he would look. I left my desk that night with my notebook pressed against my chest, my steps quick. But as I reached the exit, I froze. The security guard wasn't at his post. The lobby lights flickered, and from somewhere behind me, faint but clear, came the echo of footsteps. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I knew who it was. The glass doors reflected a shadow, tall, broad, familiar. It lingered just far enough away to remind me he wasn't finished. And in that reflection, I made another decision. If I was going to burn him, I would need to strike first. And I would need to strike harder than he ever imagined. But plans whispered in my mind like ghosts, each one fragile, each one dangerous. My revenge couldn't just be calculated. It had to be flawless, because one misstep, and I wouldn't just lose my job. I would lose everything, and maybe more than that. The next morning, the notebook felt heavier in my hands. He had his file on me, fine, but soon, I would have one on him that even his father couldn't ignore. The difference was, mine wouldn't just end his career. It would end him. Revenge always begins quietly. Not with fire, not with chaos, but with silence. Silence so sharp it cuts deeper than any scream. That's where I lived now. Inside that silence, shaping it into a weapon. I had his emails, his transactions, his arrogance written into numbers and words. But I needed more. I needed something undeniable. Something that wouldn't vanish when he pressed delete or rewrote the story. Evidence alone wasn't enough. I had to make sure the story told itself in a voice louder than mine, one he couldn't control. So I began to weave. Every day I played the role of the dutiful employee, quiet and invisible, a shadow at the edge of the boardroom. But behind that mask, I was rerouting threads. I copied files onto drives he didn't know existed. I mirrored systems he thought were locked. And little by little, I planted seeds in places he would never think to look. A misplaced invoice here, a duplicated file there, numbers that didn't add up, but only if you knew where to stare. They were small things, invisible to most, but to him, they would look like cracks spreading across glass. The notebook never left my sight. I carried it everywhere, pressing it close when the subway jolted, setting it beside me at the dinner table like a guest no one else could see. Each page was both a map and a mirror. His empire reflected back at him, stripped bare by ink. But the more I wrote, the more I understood. His fraud wasn't isolated. It bled into contracts that reached overseas, into accounts tied to faces I'd never seen. His recklessness was dangerous not just for him, but for anyone standing too close. And I was standing closer than anyone. One night, while combing through another folder, I stumbled on something new. Not invoices, not emails, photographs. Stacks of them. Parties I'd never been invited to, faces blurred by champagne and neon light. The CEO's son grinning like a king, flanked by men I recognized only from headlines, their smiles sharp and practiced. But what made my stomach turn wasn't the images. It was the captions, each one labeled, tagged, time-stamped, each one sitting in a folder marked with the company's name. This wasn't just fraud. This was leverage. The realization chilled me. He wasn't reckless, at least not entirely. He was storing evidence, keeping scorecards of the powerful, holding secrets like playing cards ready to be thrown. And if those files ever left his hands, the fallout would burn through more than a company. I should have stopped then, should have closed the folder, deleted the copy, pretended I hadn't seen. But I couldn't. Because suddenly, his arrogance that night, mocking my salary as pocket money, made perfect sense. He thought he was untouchable. He thought no one could touch him because he had already touched them all. That night I made the decision. I wouldn't just end him by exposing his theft. That would be too small, too fleeting. No, I would rip away the shield he thought made him invincible. If he believed secrets protected him, then I would make those secrets his downfall. The next morning, the office felt different. Maybe it was only me, carrying the weight of my choice like a second skin. Or maybe he felt it too, because when his eyes caught mine, his smile lingered a fraction too long. It wasn't warmth, it was warning. He knew the game had shifted. He just didn't know how much. I spent the week preparing, copying carefully, storing redundancies in places even he couldn't reach. Cloud accounts under false names. Drives slipped into safe corners of the city. A trail of truths that couldn't be erased no matter how hard he tried. But paranoia grew sharper with each step. The guards at the lobby seemed to watch me longer. My desk felt too neat, too touched. My phone buzzed with calls that never spoke when I answered. Every breath whispered the same thought. He was watching. And still, I pressed forward. Because revenge, once it takes root, doesn't wait for safety. It waits for blood. The first strike had to be invisible. Not an attack. Not an accusation. Just a whisper that would grow into a roar he couldn't silence. I started with the numbers. He trusted them because he thought they bent to his will. But numbers are merciless. Once they fracture, they spread like cracks across ice. I slipped a single file into the accounting system. A mirror of his own fraud, but tweaked, exaggerated. Just enough to raise questions if the wrong eyes saw it. And then I waited. 2 days later, I watched it happen. His face tightened in the boardroom as a junior analyst. Asked about inconsistencies in last quarter's report. It wasn't an accusation, not yet, but it was a question. And a question in the wrong hands is sharper than a blade. He laughed it off, smooth and careless, waving his hand like the matter was beneath him. The others chuckled with him, too quick to believe. But I saw the flicker in his eyes, the recognition, the suspicion. He knew someone had planted it. He just didn't know who. That night, I walked home lighter, my notebook pressed tight against me. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was proof that he could bleed. Still, my triumph soured when I turned the corner onto my street. A black car sat parked outside my building, its engine humming, its windows dark. Too clean, too polished for my neighborhood. I froze, watched, waited. Minutes passed, but no one got out. Finally, the engine cut, and the car pulled away slow, deliberate like it knew I was watching. I told myself it was coincidence. But lies, once spoken, ring hollow. Sleep became a stranger after that. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of shadow across my blinds felt like him. He was closing in, pressing against the edges of my world, reminding me that I wasn't the only one who could set traps. But fear is a funny thing. It sharpens you. It makes every thought, every action, electric. And it told me one truth I couldn't ignore. If I wanted revenge, I had to move faster. The next step was bolder, riskier. But risk had become my only language. I slipped into the server logs late one night, my fingers trembling as I moved through code. Buried in the tangle of numbers and files, I placed a breadcrumb, trail, links connecting his fraudulent accounts directly to his personal logins. It wasn't real, not yet, but it looked real. Real enough to raise alarms, real enough to ruin him if someone believed it. And I knew someone would. When he came into the office the next morning, his arrogance looked thinner. His laugh cracked at the edges. He barked at IT, demanded explanations, slammed his fist against the glass of his office door. I sat at my desk typing calmly, heart pounding so loud I thought the whole floor could hear it, because in his rage I saw something I'd been waiting for. Fear. The silence between us grew heavier after that. He stopped with the casual taunts, the mocking smiles. Now when his eyes lingered, they were sharp, hunting, desperate. He knew someone was after him, but he still didn't know it was me. And that ignorance was my shield. Yet even as I tasted control, the danger gnawed at me. One wrong move, one slip of the hand, and the mask would fall. He still had his file on me. He still had the reach to twist my story before I could speak it. That thought haunted me. Not the possibility of being caught, but the idea of being silenced before the fire had burned bright enough. So I wrote, more than ever, pages upon pages, mapping every thread, every move, every lie. My notebook became a second heartbeat, and in its ink I could almost see the ending. An ending where he stood stripped of power, stripped of arrogance, stripped of the shield of his father's name. An ending where he was nothing but ashes. The storm had been building for weeks. Every seed I planted, every breadcrumb I left had finally taken root. Whispers were spreading through. The office now, questions. Whispered too low to be overheard, but loud enough to reach him. And he felt it. I saw it in his pacing steps. The way his tie hung crooked, the fury in his voice during calls that ended too quickly. He had been untouchable for so long that suspicion was a foreign language to him. And yet here it was, wrapping around his throat. But whispers weren't enough. I needed a collapse, so I built the trap. I took every mirrored file, every breadcrumb, every copied email, and threaded them into a single, unshakable chain of evidence. Not random inconsistencies, not convenient mistakes, but a story. A story too perfect to ignore, too complete to deny. The theft, the fraud, the leverage, and the arrogance that crowned it all. I didn't send it to the CEO, not yet. That would have been too clean, too quick. I needed the sun to feel it first. I needed him to watch the walls close in, powerless to stop it. So I chose my moment carefully. The quarterly board meeting. The one where every investor, every senior executive, every pair of eyes that mattered sat at the long glass table, waiting to be dazzled by the family name. I sat at my corner seat, quiet, unimportant, just another shadow with a notepad. He walked in late, his smile tight, his charm rehearsed. He thought he could control the room, but not the screen. Because as he opened his presentation, my chain of evidence opened too. Not on my laptop, on theirs. Every board member's tablet flickered, lines of numbers reshaping into the story I had written. His emails appeared, his accounts linked, his photographs glowing under the sterile lights. And with each flicker of data, his smile broke further. "Stop!" he snapped, his voice sharp enough to echo. "This is a mistake." But no one moved. No one spoke. Because they were already reading, already seeing, already judging, and for the first time, he had no pocket of power left to hide in. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. My silence was louder than his screams. He scrambled, tried to explain, tried to frame it as sabotage, as lies, as manipulation. But the numbers didn't bend this time. The photographs didn't blur. The emails didn't vanish. And when his father finally turned to him, the disappointment in his eyes was colder than any punishment. The son had always thought fear was his weapon. But fear, when it turns, cuts deeper than any blade. He left the boardroom in silence. No one followed. No one looked away from the wreckage he had left behind. And I sat there, my pulse steady for the first time in months, knowing the trap had sprung. But even then I wasn't finished. Because destruction doesn't end in the boardroom. It ends when the empire itself collapses. The storm had been building for weeks. Every seed I planted, every breadcrumb I left had finally taken root. Whispers were spreading through. The office now, questions. Whispered too low to be overheard, but loud enough to reach him. And he felt it. I saw it in his pacing steps. The way his tie hung crooked, the fury in his voice during calls that ended too quickly. He had been untouchable for so long that suspicion was a foreign language to him. And yet here it was, wrapping around his throat. But whispers weren't enough. I needed a collapse, so I built the trap. I took every mirrored file, every breadcrumb, every copied email, and threaded them into a single, unshakable chain of evidence. Not random inconsistencies, not convenient mistakes, but a story. A story too perfect to ignore, too complete to deny. The theft, the fraud, the leverage, and the arrogance that crowned it all. I didn't send it to the CEO, not yet. That would have been too clean, too quick. I needed the sun to feel it first. I needed him to watch the walls close in, powerless to stop it. So I chose my moment carefully. The quarterly board meeting. The one where every investor, every senior executive, every pair of eyes that mattered sat at the long glass table, waiting to be dazzled by the family name. I sat at my corner seat, quiet, unimportant, just another shadow with a notepad. He walked in late, his smile tight, his charm rehearsed. He thought he could control the room, but not the screen. Because as he opened his presentation, my chain of evidence opened too, not on my laptop, on theirs. Every board member's tablet flickered, lines of numbers reshaping into the story I had written. His emails appeared, his accounts linked, his photographs glowing under the sterile lights. And with each flicker of data, his smile broke further. "Stop!" he snapped, his voice sharp enough to echo. "This is a mistake." But no one moved. No one spoke. Because they were already reading, already seeing, already judging, and for the first time, he had no pocket of power left to hide in. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. My silence was louder than his screams. He scrambled, tried to explain, tried to frame it as sabotage, as lies, as manipulation. But the numbers didn't bend this time. The photographs didn't blur. The emails didn't vanish. And when his father finally turned to him, the disappointment in his eyes was colder than any punishment. The son had always thought fear was his weapon. But fear, when it turns, cuts deeper than any blade. He left the boardroom in silence. No one followed. No one looked away from the wreckage he had left behind. And I sat there, my pulse steady for the first time in months, knowing the trap had sprung. But even then I wasn't finished. Because destruction doesn't end in the boardroom. It ends when the empire itself collapses.